Welcome to Beyond Religion, X 2 by 2 Stories of Deconstruction, where we talk with people who have left the 2 by 2 church, whose beliefs have moved beyond Christianity and organized religion. I'm joined today by Dan. Thanks for coming on, Dan.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to have this conversation and tell my story.
Yes, we get to have you on the first ever episode. So
I
this
was
is
wondering about that. I
you
wasn't
get you
sure.
get
I knew that I jumped at the chance.
yeah, you get to be the guinea pig. So we'll see how this goes. Before we really dive into your story, can you just tell us a little bit about where you're at right now? Like what's your current status?
Um, with religion or just my current status in life or both?
Well, probably with religion, and even, maybe even in terms of just religion in general, and the 2 by 2 church to a degree.
So I have some family members that are still in. My immediate family is not. My children are not. My children are adults now. Um, I'm divorced, and part of that divorce really directly had to do with me leaving the church. So heads up there as far as my story. Um, I teach biomedical sciences and do a lot of adventuring and things like that. And so what I have found is that religion in general, the way that it was presented to me as a child was largely a god of the gaps. Basically this idea that anything that couldn't be explained by science, well, God probably had something to do with that, and that's what's really important. And through my studies, I basically observed that over history those gaps kept closing, and that a lot of the things that supposedly God did, like determine what the weather was going to be, which is really important to farmers and people hunting and things like that, not so important to for people who have houses and cars and garages, things like that. So there's been this awareness that many of the things that were identified as part of what God did to control the world and the universe, that in reality can be better explained other ways. And I think that that's just generally where I'm at. Oddly enough, the predictions from within the religion that if you go that route, you'll have such a deprived life, and not only will you risk eternal damnation, which is bullshit. Oh, by the way, I forgot to ask about cussing.
Yeah, go for it. It's all good.
But the universe, as I've observed it, is not only weirder than you realize, it is weirder than you can realize. And I find great
Hmm.
pleasure in that. I find great pleasure in the new discoveries. I find great pleasure in hiking to remote areas and just observing, which one of the many changes that's occurred in the last few generations is most of us humans have become largely an indoor species. And I think getting back to nature at times can be useful. I,
Yeah,
you know,
absolutely.
I don't really necessarily think of that as the equivalent of God, but I do think of it as a place where humans are very grounded and we can observe real things going on rather than our way of explaining how things happen.
Hmm. Yeah. So, not that you have to have a term for it, but do you have a term for where your current beliefs are right now?
I do. I have a few terms. I've learned that there are some that start with an A that get some people really uptight, like enemy number one. And so I have learned to say that I'm a secular humanist. I have learned to say that scientific explanations of how things work and just concepts that have to do with how we go through our lifespan explain most of the things that I can observe. Much shared experience amongst a lot of people. And when you come across someone who has a little different experience than yours, that can be interesting as well.
Certainly. Cool. Well, thanks for that little preview. So, like going back to the kind of the beginning, you want to share a little bit about what your childhood was like? I assume that you grew up in the church.
I have just a little warning I'm going to give to the listener, and I think of this as informed consent because that's sort of where I come from. So, if you value having faith in the 2 by 2 religion or want to keep right where you are and believing in a personal God, this particular podcast may not be for you. I don't know how it will impact you, but I'm literally talking about the things that corroded my faith and the logic, because that's really the way that I approached a lot of this. And so, if any of this applies to you, you should probably scram. Uh, but oh, and I did write this down just for fun. Consider this God speaking to you through His weak earthen vessel. But
Yeah. I appreciate the warning ahead of time. The purpose of this podcast is to kind of shine a light on some of the stories that aren't necessarily the ones that we hear very often coming out of the 2 by 2 church, and just interested to find out more about what led people to, non-belief.
Yeah. So now that it's just us, I'd say at my core, I am a curious, sort of science minded person. And I've been that ever since I was little. And so one of the things that I want to mention now, and then I'll jump into sort of a little bit more about who I am and my childhood, um, is that I've come to the conclusion that a lot of important things in life are actually paradoxes, and so or can be paradoxical. And sometimes things that appear to be one thing, like very wholesome and pure, they can actually be a facade for things that can actually be very corrupt and potentially dangerous, or vice versa. So, anyways, we're gonna get there. I'm a third generation two by two, and now an X two by two. I had a wife, which I'm going to use the term partner. I think that that's a good word to practice using for almost 20 years. And I found her within the two by two religion. We were both children. I remember her when she was like, I don't know, 5 or 6. So we grew up somewhat together. And as of right now, I stopped taking part about 20 years ago, and I stopped going to meeting about 15 years ago. And I did not realize that that 5 years of continuing to go to meetings as part of my little family, but not taking part, was a big deal. And in recent years, through some of the Facebook groups and some of the other communication that I've had with other people, I found out that what I thought was just me being respectful and keeping some connection with my childhood and with my family values and all of that, other people sort of interpreted as an act of defiance or a way of me, being there but not participating. And so that was interesting to me, because that was actually not my purpose at that time. My purpose was mostly to be respectful and to not have my partner have to go to meeting alone, especially with small children. We'll talk about some of the problems that caused, and maybe why on the outside, other people would come to the conclusion that I was being defiant. Um, so I was in practice as a healthcare provider for about 3 years, but for the last 25 years, I've taught biomedical sciences. So that's just a little bit about where I'm at in my life right now. And my children are now grown up. Um, I thought, just for fun, since the traditional way that people in the two by twos would find out, "Hey, are you in?" was to ask if you know the name of an overseer or something like that. But since I'm no longer in the felonship, I think that's the way it's pronounced now. I figured I'd just list some other things. So in Europe, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, but Wurgel, Austria, excuse me, Penrith, England, Preston, England. In North America, Salmon Arm, Duncan. In the Pacific Northwest, Parma, Oric, Boring, Saginaw, Milltown, Olympia, Walla Walla, Chelan, Ronan. Those were some of my haunts. Those are places that I've been. Now, not all of them were conventions that were actively running at the time. In particular, in Europe, I might have been there vacationing. I did do a year in Western Europe as part of my university studies. So I guess those are my bona fides, rather than talking about overseers. Okay, so
Perfect.
on to childhood here. So I was born on a military base during the Vietnam era. My dad was one of many conscientious objectors with inside the group, inside the religious group. Um, so conscientious objectors, I think it was after World War II that they became a possible way of being drafted but not carrying a weapon. And the interesting thing there is that only a few bases in the United States would train those individuals. So what happened is a lot of the men within the two by twos got drafted. They I don't even remember who the worker is. You might know. Had in the U.S. had named the group Christian Conventions and
Right.
indicated that um, they were pacifists essentially, and so then they were eligible to not be draft dodgers, but also not to have to go and carry a weapon. And so my dad was there. I was born there, and of course my parents met a lot of people within the religion that have, of course, since after that went all over the U.S. in particular. So they got to know a lot of people. Um, So I remember being little and playing meetings with my siblings. Unfortunately, the toy poodle and the cat were involved as well, which were very good at simulating how little kids act during meeting, especially because we put them in
Yes.
clothes and they needed to be quiet. There might have been some spankings. Um,
Oh, spanking is a required part of playing meeting, isn't it?
yeah, actually, I um, one of my children experienced that. Thankfully, I saw the error of my ways, and I have talked to that child about that and how I feel bad.
Yeah.
Um,
I've had the same conversation with my kids actually.
I was always the one that the child was handed to, and it was like, "Do something."
Of course.
And so
Yeah.
it did eventually evolve into, well, I'd really sort of be rather be here in this room hanging out with you and us talking to one another quietly or doing whatever than going back in. So my
Mhm.
faith, it eroded very slowly. I tried to hold it together for a long, long time. Um, and I'll come to that because we have to get to college. And right now I'm only at like, I don't know, 5 years old. So
Right.
just a couple other little highlights. So I do remember I was probably just a couple years older than that, hearing a worker say that the bass beat of rock music was the heartbeat of the devil. And I remember that really
Oh my
having
god.
an impact on me and me going, wow, I didn't realize that music was so powerful. And to this day, with my students in particular during breaks, a lot of times I'll play music and I'm a bit embarrassed that I grew up not knowing much about music. In my household, some types of country music and then classical music and then hymns. That was it. That was pretty much
Mhm.
anything other than that was considered soft contraband, but it's not like
Right.
I wanted to be a good kid. I get the feeling that you and I were sort of similar that way. We wanted to fit in
Absolutely.
and not make
I
waves.
was a good kid. Yep.
Now, one of my best friends, who I found out he was my best friend because my dad told me he was my best friend because we were born on the same military base. So that's some interesting, and
Okay.
we do have a lot of great shared memories. I'm not wanting to downplay that, but that is sort of a weird way
Yeah.
to get a best friend. Um,
Right.
his family was quite a bit different, and he was really into music, so I sort of got exposed to music through him. But we lived about an hour and a half away, and so we didn't get to see one another that often. I remember being asked why I was praying in middle school during lunch. So this is something I took seriously. And there
Yeah.
were times that
Good.
I wouldn't pray, and I felt guilty about it because most of the time I did think about it. It was one of those things that you were supposed to do. And then another thing that I know a lot of other people did not feel this way, but I think this is a shared experience, is I didn't feel like I could be close to people if they were not within the religion. So I would be sort of school friends and things like that. But if anyone tried to get too friendly, I felt like I had to sort of push away. And I'm pretty sure my parents would probably say that they didn't tell me to do that, but that's sort of what I had heard from the platform. And again, I was trying to be a good kid, and now I look back at that and I'm like, oh my goodness, there were some good people that we have shared memories with, that I could have had some great experiences, and that was sort of, I was directed away from that.
Yeah. It wasn't spoken out loud, but it was like you just knew what was expected, right?
I remember it being spoken from the platform.
Oh.
Yeah, yeah,
Well,
that
there's
spending
that
time
too.
yeah, that spending time with people who are not within the religious group was not a good idea, and that, it, because I actually sort of paid attention through a lot of my childhood. Um, So in high school, I found out that I actually was pretty good at science. Although, because of sort of an alternative healthcare type perspective, and probably my evident sort of religious overtones, I remember I had to get permission from one of my instructors in order to take a more advanced class the next year. And even though I think I got in a decent grade, I think I got a B, which in a general biology class, that instructor did not want to give me permission. And I remember being really upset about that. And she did end up giving me permission. I ended up acing the class. It was one of my best classes of my high school
Wow.
experience.
That's very interesting that she kind of like took a cue from somewhere.
And to be honest, if someone comes into a class and they maybe are well read, but everything they interpret more from, I mean, I don't know that I talked about biblical stuff, but
Right.
they just have a different perspective than the typical textbook or science perspective. And it's like, where's this kid coming from? So I can understand that now. But I'm like,
Yeah.
whew, thank goodness I got into the class that ended up really having a huge impact on me. Um, so then I went off to college, and I do have some thoughts on that. it was expected that I would go to college, and my female siblings, it was expected they would not go to college.
Mm,
And at least one of them has this huge passion for healing and for learning about how to take care of people, and has applied that a lot with actually animal husbandry. And so, but the option of going to veterinary school or going to some sort of medical school or nursing or something like that, um, just it wasn't even discussed. The expectation was that both of my sisters would actually get married and be members within the group.
mhm,
Um, so I was studying more molecular level biology type stuff, and so much of that, we didn't have a concept of intelligent design back then, but there were already pushbacks from religion that, oh, science can't explain all these things. And what I was finding is that actually a lot of the stuff can be explained. And so, by the time I was at college, plate tectonics had been understood for a few decades, which it's not really that old of a concept. Geology is not my forte, but
right,
certainly, a revolutionary concept. They were getting into DNA. They were looking at how molecules can tell us a lot about cells and organisms and all that, and that really spoke to me. That became an important part of my world because that was what I was majoring in, and I remember going, "Wow, this is connecting all of life together in a way that's very different from my experience." In my childhood and how I was told the universe was put together. We actually
right.
share these molecules. Um, for some reason, in thinking about this interview, podcast, video cast that we're doing, I kept thinking of me as a little kid in our family field where there was a creek. And I would play in the creek. I would make dams. I would float little boats and stuff. And I think, yeah, I'm like, why do I keep thinking of this? It has nothing to do with religion. This really doesn't have anything
Mm,
to do even with science that I've studied. But it was maybe one of the purest moments in my life where I, all by myself, could just see how things really worked. And that has been an important part of who I am. And so I think that's why that little scene kept coming up. So those sorts of things I would really pay attention to. We did not have a TV in my house. We had a TV at my dad's clinic, and so we got an encyclopedia, one a month. And every time we'd get a new encyclopedia volume, those of you who don't know what that sort of encyclopedia is, you young whippersnappers, just go on Wikipedia and look it up. Um,
It's like Wikipedia, but printed out and not nearly as advanced.
so
Yeah,
you get A, and then you get bi, B through bi, and then you get
right.
whatever b h bj through, oh, I shouldn't have mentioned that. Anyways, you get that through the rest of the b's, and then in order to get the whole alphabet of things in the encyclopedia, it may be like 30 volumes, and then they'd have a couple time annual update. And so the reason why I mention that is the routine. It would come in the mail. I would open it up, I'd look at every single page, and then it'd go up on the shelf. Now, I wouldn't read every word, but I would look at every page
Mhm.
before it would go up on the shelf, and then I would actually use it just in my daily life if I was curious about something. It was right around the time I was heading to college. I was at a convention. It was my home convention where I learned that the 2x2s had a founder in the late 1890s.
Because that would have been not too long after the Secret Sect came out, right?
And I think that book was mentioned. Um, and it was a close family member who mentioned it, and then it was very downplayed and like, oh well, even if it's true, it doesn't matter. Which to me, I'm like, oh, even if, like the only thing I've heard is that this is continuous from Jesus's apostles. That's the only thing I had heard prior to that. So I'm like, that's sort
Right.
of weird. Um, let's see. So I did go and study for a year in Europe. Um, the lads at my in my dorm for my birthday gave me The Blind Watchmaker by Richard Dawkins,
Oh
which
wow.
um yeah, which I
Wham!
read.
Here you go.
Yeah, which I read, which it actually, for those of you who aren't aware of that book, it basically is taking an analogy that ties in with intelligent design that I'd already sort of mentioned. And there's this analogy that if you were to come across a watch, you would know that there had to be a watchmaker. And this was an argument that was used for why the universe has to have been created by a god. Um, And so I read it cover to cover because I actually read just about anything handed to me. And I'm like, wow, this explains a lot. And I think it was in that book Dawkins mentioned God of the Gaps. And he mentioned that a lot of these things are going to become hypotheses that we can actually test. I don't think back then he had any idea how powerful genetic studies and some of the other studies would become. Um, while I was in Europe, I did have a older couple who were within the religion. The wife did not really participate. They described her as having nerves, which I don't know what that meant. It now I would interpret that as she realized that there was a lot of bullshit going on and couldn't put up with it. But they were very,
Mm.
very kind to me. They went out of their way most Sundays. I was there eating their food, and a lot of times on Wednesdays I'd be picked up as well. I did get assaulted riding back from a Bible study, riding my bicycle back to campus, and I
Oh
ended
wow.
up with a dislocated shoulder. Um, I had studied martial arts for quite a while, so I jumped up off my bike and prepared to defend myself, and didn't have to. But I'm like, well, that's sort of an interesting way. This was before I got the blind watchmaker. That's an interesting way of God rewarding me. um, oh, anyways, it was that older gentleman who I remember him talking about some people during their testimonies, they would spiritualize the cat. And I'm like, well, what does that even mean? He's like, they would take things that are clearly not spiritual and try and spiritualize them. He didn't have high opinion of cats. And I think that was
I
the
like
first
that.
time that I ever really remembered someone sort of saying that some things couldn't be spiritualized. Um, let's see, while I was there, I also became aware that having a radio in your car, or even just a radio of any sort anywhere, was frowned upon by the workers in particular, but a lot of the friends monitored it.
Hmm.
And that was one of the first times that I really became aware of, oh, what I grew up with, the standards that I grew up with in the Pacific Northwest, they may not be applied worldwide. It may be different in different areas. I was told that some workers had been known to snap radio antennas off of cars. The individual who I was in the car, had a health condition. She was a young lady about my age, in her 20s, and so actually the government healthcare system paid for that car. So no one could snap the antenna off because it wasn't her personal property, which was a weird thought that she could have it and have the radio, but because it belonged to the government, then the workers
Mm,
allegedly wouldn't go after it. So I remember
right.
thinking that was sort of interesting.
A nice little loophole that she found herself in.
Well, I don't know that she created it, but I did find an audio tape in the back seat, and I made mention of it, and she was mortified. And I'm like, this isn't a big deal. Like, I mean, we at that point I had, been listening to Def Leppard and, Men Without Hats and all sorts of stuff that actually my friend
Yeah.
had introduced me to. So, and we had made mixtapes. Actually, we participated in the whole mixtape era, which the younglings will know nothing about. Um, so that was startling. And then I was informed, oh yeah, it wasn't that long ago, and a lot of the old ladies in this part who went to meeting, they felt everyone should wear black stockings, and I'm like, what? So um anyways, I over that time that I was there, I did slowly sort of drift away and just focus on my studies. I got too busy to go to meeting on a regular basis. I was actually trying to heal up. I did end up having shoulder dislocations for over 20 years in that shoulder, which seems stupid,
Oh
but
wow.
a year and a half later, I actually got in a different accident and dislocated my other shoulder, which was my right shoulder. And so then I had a surgery to repair my right shoulder. And there were some things that did not go well. They collapsed one of my lungs. Um,
Oh wow. Okay.
and so the one that I got injured in Europe, it was a more complicated surgery, and I'm like, I just need to put this off. It's not my dominant hand, but like I would average at least a dislocation a month,
Oh
which
my
makes me
gosh.
one, yeah, for like 20
That's
years. Don't do
cra-
don't do the
that's
math on that.
crazy.
That
Oh
math
my
sucks.
gosh.
Um, so just some weirdness there. I did end up getting it repaired. They had better surgical techniques that were available, and I shouldn't have waited as long as I did. But I do have stable shoulders now. But possibly
Good.
possibly might
Good
have
to hear.
impacted me a little psychologically, to tell you the truth.
Right.
Um, so I was pretty lonely in England, or in Europe. I did just actually say the country. It doesn't matter that much.
I can cut it out.
And
You're good.
yeah, not a big deal. and came back. And within 8 months of being back, I ended up dating a gal, got engaged pretty quickly. Not good planning. I think a lot of it was I was in my early 20s. We know what high testosterone does. We know what the rules are, and it's just like this is what I'm supposed to do. And this person seems to be a good person. Um, we waited to have kids for quite a while. Um, and so I think it was around having my first child that we'd moved. I was teaching. I had been in practice for a while prior to that, and just finding a place where I could really settle down and do doctoring on people. It didn't look like that was going to happen in a way that was reasonable to me. And so
Hmm.
um, we had Bible study in our home. And so I became an elder. And I was a little nervous with it. I wanted to, I'm in a pretty small area, or I was in a pretty small area, still am. And so there weren't a lot of homes available. And it's like, well, I can do this. Um, when my oldest child was about 2, I was really actually struggling because I was working long hours, helping with kids, helping with the child, um, and the workers out of the blue said, "We think that you should have Sunday meeting in your home." And I'm like, being an elder of Sunday meeting to me is in a different league from being a Wednesday night Bible study leader.
Right.
I don't believe the things that someone should believe in order to do that. Out of respect for the religion, I should not be that. I'm like, you can have meeting in my home, but I should not be the one leading it. And that, I mean, it blindsided me. They didn't really warn me, and I just told them how I actually felt. And I remember being pretty like, on one hand, yes, I am correct in what I'm saying. I'm being respectful of everyone involved. On the other hand, I knew very much that there were people who were going to be very disappointed in me, and yet it was still the right decision. And so I stuck to my
Hmm.
guns. And even though this was not really encouraged, I did go to counseling. I went to all of 2 counseling sessions and didn't have much more to talk about by the end of the second session. Everyone seemed to be settling down. We continued having Bible study in our home. I didn't lead it. And I'm like, okay, maybe this is going to work out. And it was a little bit after that I found out that we had become pregnant. You know how male and female pregnancies
Yeah.
work,
Yep.
um,
I
with
do.
another child. And I remember thinking to myself, okay, maybe this wasn't as big of a deal as I thought. Maybe this is okay. Um, there'd been a little bit of conversation. My partner wasn't like super expressive about sort of deep thoughts and emotions. And so I'm like, okay, maybe things are okay. So had an additional child, and things just started sort of escalating slowly. Now, some of it is probably at least partially my fault. um, I was working really long hours, like sometimes crazy long hours. There were a few times actually in the early days. This would have been um, before my oldest, but it gives you an idea. I literally fell asleep while lecturing to a class.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so in meetings, my option was to either sit there, participate, and listen, which I'm cannot turn off the crap detector,
Hmm.
or to not listen, which means I'm going to fall asleep. And so I did a lot of sleeping during certain segments of the meetings, which of course pissed people off. And I'm like, I'm
Right.
trying to be kind here because that's the same BS. I mean, and now I'm saying it more with more exuberance than I would have, and venom than I
Right.
would have back then. But you said the same BS last week, and it really like quit talking about the frickin' cat, to go back to
Yeah.
another prior
Right.
theme. And we all know that, if you've been there, that there's just this pressure that you have to have something to say. That it's not enough to live your life. There is this expectation that you have something profound to say.
Yep. Yeah. And if you don't have something to say, that speaks volumes to the members, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
this person's not faithful. Um, this. I will say that I was one of those people. Probably more so after the Bible study was in our home, but and I was leading it, that would be emotional. I'd be really
Mhm.
emotional, and over time it became clear to me that a lot of that emotion was feeling like I had to thread a needle of being true to myself, but also doing what was expected of me. and
Hmm.
there very much it was and is a form to the way that things could be talked about. What sort of things were on limit, were within limits, and what things were off limits. Um, it be very there's very much a formula, and anyone who's even a little bit different, people notice that. Um,
Right.
Side, just a little tangent here that I think is relevant. I was thinking about today. Um, as I think most of us know, most workers are not very dynamic speakers, and
Hmm.
yet the definition of a cult is that you have these charismatic people who control the masses with what they say. And it just dawned on me for the first time today, thinking about this upcoming interview. Oh, those ones who aren't very dynamic, number one, they're more relatable to the average person, and number two, they set a really low bar for a charismatic speaker.
That's
That
right.
just dawned on me today. um, so anyways, there's always this pressure, and it's worse for workers. And by the way, even though overseers for sure, lots of workers have been sort of accused, I am very aware that if there are any victims in this, it has to be the workers, as at least as much as any of the friends. And that does not excuse bad behavior that hurts people.
No, absolutely.
But I don't think that it's in anyone's interest to vilify workers as a whole, because a lot of them went in with good intentions and with a pure heart, I think. But the circumstances, because of what the religion is built on, just made it impossible for them to be good people sometimes. Um,
Yeah.
so we're almost to the point of me stopping going to meeting.
When you, let's see, you mentioned that you had to kind of craft your testimony in a way that was true to yourself, but also still kind of fit the two by two model. Were you having like, were you feeling like your beliefs were not completely lining up with the average two by two expectation?
Absolutely. So one of the things that I remember first is just I was convinced that there was absolutely no way the universe could be 6,000 to 10,000 years old. And the
Hmm.
fact that sometimes that had been spoken from the platform, and that a lot of people felt like that, you know, was sort of a given, and that if you believed in that newfangled evolution thing where maybe things might be hundreds of thousands or more years, that, wow, you must be rebellious. And so, I wouldn't talk about something like that. This is going to sound potentially arrogant. I've been called arrogant before, and sadly, sometimes the shoe has fit. But
No, that's
the
okay.
the intellectual standard for giving a testimony was not particularly difficult, if that makes
Right.
sense. So, I mean, I had grown up with the Bible. I don't remember a ton of verses, but I remember the general stories. And in fact, there was a time in my teens, in through my early years in my marriage, where I'd go to young people get togethers or whatever, and I'd hear a worker say something stupid, and I might call him out on it.
Hmm.
In particular, only date people who are professing. And I brought up Samson. I'm like, actually, the person who was within the Hebrew group, I'm not sure that they were called Hebrews then, was the one who betrayed him, and his partner that was faithful to him was actually not of the children of God. And there are other examples of that. And
Right.
so, anyways, and emotionally, some other stuff, I'm probably weaker or not as put together as some other people, but the actual logic of putting together a testimony, that was not a real problem. That and
Right.
that sounds sort of horrible, because I would actually agonize over it, but when it came down to it, I knew that I could put something together, even if I
Right.
only woke up late and got my clothes on, and well, I guess I'll just open the Bible and whatever's there. Oh, that verse will
Right.
work, and
Yeah, I think
that's
that's a very relatable experience for a lot of
I
people.
feel bad about even just portraying it that way, but that's really the way that it was.
Yeah.
Um, so things kept heating up at home. I kept falling asleep, and I think I remember somewhat gently being told a time or two that that was obnoxious. No question as to why it was happening, but just hey. Um,
And so at this point, you were not taking part anymore. Is that correct?
5 years I didn't.
Yeah. Interesting.
And yeah, when it all came down to it, about 5 years. And so not just at my home meeting, like anywhere that we went, if we
Right.
traveled, I went, yeah, went to convention, not participating. Um, So trying to decide how much detail to go into. Essentially, I stayed home for a convention because there was some work that needed to be done on the house. In particular, an upstairs bathroom, someone had put in the wrong type of screw that was of the wrong metal, and it actually did an electrolysis. And every time someone used the bathtub or the shower, it would actually rain water over our oven and range in the kitchen,
Oh
and
my
the
goodness.
hood and the microwave and everything. And
Right.
so we had a tight budget. We had a little kid, and I was working. My partner was not. She was taking care of our child. And so I'm like, well, we need to have a plumber come out. I can't do that, but I can do all of the rest. I can take down, the parts of the kitchen. I can do the sheetrock. I can, put that all back together. And so really the only time that I could do that was convention, because otherwise we basically needed to cook meals. We didn't feel like we could afford to go out to eat for however long it would take. Um, and so when my partner came back, things were really a lot rougher. And I remember being told, you are evil. You do not believe in God. Um, and I'm like, what the hell is going on? I try and debate or whatever and say, I have morals, I have values. Where's this coming from? Um, so that continued escalating, started just going full blast for a few months. Um, Now I do want to actually provide at least some understanding from the perspective of my partner. My partner had gone through a really sudden, painful, and serious health crisis where she thought she might die. Um, and that was 2 years after our last child. And recovered from that, had some significant pain, didn't get a full recovery. I encouraged physical therapy. I mean, I don't need to go into all the detail, but it was really tough.
Yeah.
Um,
Right.
and so I can't but help think that that had something to do with this. I'm going to skip over a lot of detail, but I became aware that a man who was within the religion was at the very least very inappropriately communicating with my wife, and that was a huge surprise to me. Found out that there was other stuff that were surprises, some of them having to do with finances, things like that.
Hmm.
And so I didn't believe in divorce. The weird thing is I hadn't been taking part for like 4 years at that point, and yet a
Right.
lot of the values had stuck.
In in that, sorry to interrupt just once, in that 4 year span, uh, that you were not taking part, were you admitting to yourself or to anybody else that you didn't believe in God at that point?
I think I knew deep down, just because of the things that I had read, the things that I had thought about. But to me, being an ethical person, being a moral person, being a good person that has value, and believing in God were connected with one another.
Hmm.
And so I was trying to carve away the part that had to do with, direct and overt belief in God, and say, but the moral and ethical portion of that is still there. And in fact, a family member, when Bible study was taken out of my home without me even being talked to about it, and it was said that it
Oh
was
wow.
my desire to do that. Um, I met with someone who had a little bit of authority, happened to be a relative of mine, and rather than hearing my story, he did a couple of things that were very interesting. One was all sorts of accusations that, if you don't believe in God, then you're a bad person. So I knew where some of that might have been coming from with my partner. But the other thing, which I found very interesting, is even if you don't believe in God, you should pretend like you do, because your salvation and hell is it in jeopardy. And at that point, my thought is, oh, this person doesn't believe in God either. They're just pretending.
Wow. That,
Because the
yeah,
only
that's quite an admission.
if you actually have a connection with an entity that has any sort of power in your life, there you would not encourage someone to pretend. You would say, no, you keep going until you
Yeah.
get that connection. And it dawned on
Right.
me during a very tough discussion where I was upset, I was emotional. Oh, this person's been faking it the whole time. And at that point, my respect for that individual just plummeted. I'm like, this person's a faker. They're not authentic. I have more morality and ethics than this person does, and they're trying to give me advice. Um, so yeah, that was interesting. I'd forgotten a little bit about that. Um, I'm going to back up just a little bit regarding belief in God and how that could impact someone, because I had the opportunity to listen to Mahatma Gandhi's grandson while I was at university. And he talked about how Gandhi would look at pencils and say, you always want a brand new pencil, but this pencil you can still use. There, you don't need to have the pride of having a new pencil. You can do that. And so here's this person who universally is pretty well respected as an amazing um, individual in leading India out of their servitude and occupation and just some of the horrific things that the British Empire was doing to them. And he took the time to think about the little things. I also got to meet Linus Pauling, the only two-time Nobel Prize winner who won them individually. Didn't have much interaction. Interestingly enough, I have a family member who'd had a couple days of interaction with Linus Pauling,
Mm,
and Linus Pauling was not a believer, and yet through his understanding about nuclear proliferation and the risks that it could cause on the planet, he got the Unshared Peace Prize, even though there were thousands of people who were in some of the activities that he was in, because he was the one person who wouldn't back down. Einstein backed down, a variety of other people backed down. Linus Pauling wouldn't. And there's actually pretty good evidence that because of that and the fact that he was not granted a visa to go to Europe to a major conference, he did not get access to the X ray crystallography data that Watson and Crick got, and therefore he probably missed winning the Nobel Prize for discovering the structure of DNA. It's sort of a what if, but he was expected to
right.
be the front runner. I've read the papers or the letters between him um, and Rosalind Franklin, I think that's her name, who did her and Watkins actually did the X-ray crystallography of DNA, and but he said it doesn't matter if I discover great things in chemistry or biology or whatever. If we blow the planet up, who cares? And so he
Right.
wouldn't back down. And so I remember going, oh, here's someone who like he has an impact on other people, and it's because of his principles. And oh, by the way, he's not a believer, which at that point it wasn't a big deal to me.
Yeah.
Also at college, I came across a fellow by the name of Neil Postman, and he's a philosopher really thinking about this was way before the World Wide Web, but thinking about how technology, in particular TVs, impact people. And I'm like, hey, I don't have a TV. And he's like, yeah, that's not what I'm talking about. You're obviously one of those weirdos. He didn't say that. That's the way I interpreted it. That's not really the discussion here, because that
Right.
is being so counterculture that it's not the point that he was making. The point is we don't understand how this technology is impacting us, which that so my point is, I met a few people who are really deep thinkers. Those are some of the ones who come to mind right now. And
Mhm.
they had a magnetism and an aura around them that really impacted other people because of the depth of their thoughts and their persistence with that. And I just didn't see that in people who claim to have a one-on-one relationship with God. So
Mhm.
it's like, really? Like, yes, I do believe in the parable of the fruit of a tree, and I'm not seeing any. There's a lot of fake
Right.
fruit.
Yep.
Anyways, um, so I didn't believe that I there would be anything that could cause me to get a divorce. Did a variety of all the things that were available. Did to try and see where we were with the marriage. And anyone who's gone through that, I don't need to go through details. It's just always really messy. I felt
Yeah.
blindsided, and in fact, I said I don't believe in divorce. There's nothing that could be done. And then I was told, well, I'm moving out and I'm taking the kids with me, and you won't know where we're going. And I'm like, I'm not losing access to the kids. I don't understand what's going on. I just know there's been a lot of lying going on to me. And it seems I had read studies about how important fathers are, et cetera. And so I did file for divorce. The only way that I could get what was called a order of restraint, which is not the same as a restraining order, was to file for divorce. I had no one in my life near me to support me, and no one in my life that I could think of who had gone through a divorce. And I stopped going to meeting. I did go for a while, but like when you're in the middle of a divorce, there's really no point in going to
Right.
meeting with your partner as you're
Ye
separating ways. And
right, right.
there were accusations that I was just making things difficult. And so it was at that point I just like, okay, I have to stop. I did go to counseling. Um, that counselor, I don't know how they do it. He should have got paid way more than he did. I don't know how much he made, but one concept that really resonated with me is it comes from fiction, oddly enough, fantasy more. Is I like I'm fighting the Balrog. I may be Gandalf the Grey. I'm gonna die. Who I am will no longer exist. The only
Hmm.
hope is to, have a Phoenix type moment to come back as somebody different, maybe better, maybe stronger, but to survive because I needed to for my kids. Um, but I would not be the same person on the other side. And I was very aware of that. And so that ended up opening up the possibility of really thinking about everything in my life. Because marriage being tied to religion, no divorce, even though I didn't believe in eternal life, my partner did.
Hmm.
Was I being kind to my partner if I, because of struggles that she was having and that I was having as well, different struggles that we weren't able to support one another in, was I jeopardizing her? But when it came to the kids, I'm like, yeah, okay, there is something that would cause me to divorce someone.
Hmm.
Um,
Okay.
I will say that there are relationships beyond marriage to a two by two partner. I am envious of those of you, so envious of those of you who had people near you to support you, in particular, a partner and or a family living with
Right.
you to support you. I live in some ways sort of on the edge of the earth, and they're like none of the people that I knew would either understand or were in a position where they could support me. And so it was very
Right.
lonely, which I think is a common experience.
Yeah. And your partner was continuing to go to meetings during this time, I assume.
There was a point where I just decided to stop paying attention. As far as I know, um, if goes very infrequently, and the only reason why I feel okay saying that is that because of my decision, along with a lot of at least little decisions by my partner, which we have co-parented successfully.
Hmm.
Um, my children have largely been raised outside of being meeting kids or members of the two by two, and they use like, okay,
Okay.
that's mom and dad's thing, and
Hmm.
they're dealing with it in their own ways, over time. Which I'm very thankful for that. I'm very thankful for that. My hope is that my children, they will learn about the world. They'll learn about religion. They'll learn about what actually seems right to them about the way the universe works, and then pursue that, and with the understanding that probably that's going to change as time goes on. If I have any area of expertise, it is in systems biology. I'll just put it that way,
Hmm.
primarily relating to humans, whether it be microbes or whatever. So stuff having to do with religion, although I have been a self study on it and it for my own purpose, I've looked into this. Um, there are some concepts I may have wrong. Most of them I have tried to fact check and verify on my own. But part of that process is at the institution I work at. I had a student say, "Hey, I'd like to form a secular student alliance," which, by the way, is a great organization for people who do not have any faith in religion or in God.
Right.
And so I got to actually be the faculty who oversaw that, and I was the advisor. And so I sat in all the meetings. Occasionally, I would speak up a little bit because I could relate to some of it. And what I observed is about half of the people in the group had left religion, and about half of them had really not been raised in religion and just sort of saw it as like the kooky neighbors, down the street.
Right.
Um, but let's see, we certainly had ex Mormons, we certainly had an ex Scientologist, which was pretty interesting.
Wow.
Some other a little bit more mainstream type religions. I've learned that the Pacific Northwest, from about the 1960s to the 1990s, was really a hotbed for cults and other extreme religion. In my microbiology class that I teach, the largest incidents of domestic terrorism occurred due to the Rajanishis trying to poison people for a
Right.
vote in the Dalles, Oregon. To this day, it was religious based, and it was to try and swing political power. Um, so, in just trying to deconstruct everything, the whole God of the Gaps concept made me go back in time and go, okay, well, where did religion really even start? And the short answer is I don't know, but I've got some guesses. Obviously, there are people who are professionals at studying this, but nature's pretty amazing. So there are mountains that literally make their own weather. There are animals that can do amazing things, whether it be um, sneaky tricksters like the coyote, or I actually have with my students dissected cats a lot. Felines have amazing anatomy, and they they don't really want to get in fights because their bones are pretty weak, but
Mm,
their musculature I mean, they can just do incredible stuff that really no other mammal on the planet, no other group can do the jumps and can do some of the athletics that they can do, but they can't do it all the time because they aren't durable like the canids. So anyways, that's just my nerdy modern way of saying that people would have been involved in animism, different animals, whether they depend on them for food, whether it be like the bison, and places. But the thing is, animals, they can behave differently depending on what's going on. Places aren't really portable, so that really
right.
limited religion, of course. And so then, the pantheon of gods, whether it, be sort of elemental type gods, things like that, started to become a more powerful concept. You could share that with other people. Maybe maybe you're really into sea otters, and actually some of the tribal, or I like to call them First Nations people, the way that they do in Canada. Um, in the area where I live, they're a very important part of their mythology, a very important part of the tribal identity,
Right.
and yet that's not portable. You can't take that inland, okay? And so
Yeah.
more more just conceptual gods naturally would occur, and then you start having a pantheon of gods, and it's like, well, wait a sec, if you have fewer, that each of them has more power, then they can take out each of the pantheon of weaker gods, or the place
Right.
gods. And so then
It's like doing that thing when you do with superheroes when you're a kid, like, oh, could Batman beat up Superman? Or
exactly, you got, so
yeah,
you got just like have to buff up, um,
right.
and so monotheism was almost an inevitable consequence of human civilization, very portable, and the number one god can beat all the others. um, And so that really happened with, of course, Judaism and the Hebrew people, which is sort of the basis of the Bible. It may have happened a few other times. Again, I'm not a great historian. The main limiting factor of that is it was a covenant based religion. And so the covenant only applied to certain people, and it was hard to get in. And, some of the covenants, it's like, well, why do we even have this stupid thing about flax written down, and, cloven hooves, and, stuff like that?
Hmm.
Um, and so then Christianity came along, and this may seem a little bit crass. Of okay, Jesus may have been a person, may not, but the thing is, like the Jesus story is one that, just like all the gods, which there are about 3,000 of them, where it was a story told over and over again. The Jesus story, there were people that believed in gods that had very similar stories that predated Jesus, um, and so this personal type of God was something somewhat new. And so, anyways, one way of summarizing it, I'm going to come back to Christianity just in a moment, and the Holy Trinity, which I think I have a sort of a unique take on that. It's really horrendous, the Holy Trinity. I have come to actually loathe that concept, and I think that it is ripe for people to realize just how manipulative it is. But so Judaism, covenant, can't break the rules, but other than that, you're the chosen people. Christians, well, you can become the chosen person because someone has, paid for that. So now everybody, it's not exclusive membership. It's like everyone, but you have to have faith. And really, you need to show that faith in various ways, but ultimately, you have to have faith. Along comes Islam, and Islam, from what I understand, and I do have a little bit of background, but not a lot, is it's much more about, hey, I didn't forget God. I am praying multiple times a day. It's more about demonstrating that, not so much faith, but demonstrating the willingness to serve. And
Hmm.
in some ways, I would say each of those is an evolution in power of the God. um,
Yeah.
so then, even though the Trinity concept was somewhat developed before Islam, here's the thing: when it comes to humans developing, young people often will respect authority. And so you've got this omnipotent being that supposedly made everything, although we can't really see him or her make things these days. But
Right.
there's a part of life, usually teenage years, where people sort of rebel from authority, And so you could lose people from that sort of a God. And there are different religions that sort of play with that. I think the Mennonites and or the Amish, they'll have allow people to go on out, but they have
Right.
claws and strings attached. Um, so this concept of Jesus, instead of it being about this powerful creep monitoring you that could zap you, it's more like, no, this is your buddy who like paid the ultimate price for you. So it's more
Right.
about peer pressure. Okay. And I think
Hmm.
a lot of people sort of get that. But the one that's really insidious is the one that seems like it's almost not talked about. And that, of course, is the Holy Spirit or the Holy Ghost. And that's like, no. Well, and as people get older, they're like, okay, well, yeah, Jesus died. But the joke amongst us who are non believers is like, well, he sacrificed a long weekend for us because, he rose again. Um,
Right.
so everybody dies. Okay, not a big deal. But then this concept of, well, actually, you are sort of the God. Being Christ-like isn't actually talking about Jesus. It's about talking about the Holy Spirit being inside you. And
Right.
so the Holy Trinity, or the unholy Trinity, sort of the way I think of it now, is about three angles of attack on your psyche to hold you in place. And you can play one off the other. Of course, there is actually a fourth piece. And by the way, I'm going to give you a very old sounding, it may even come, right around the time of animism, and that is air, water, earth, fire. So God, air, Jesus, water, Holy Spirit, earth, which we're made of dust, earth.
Right.
Well, what's the fire? What's the fire? Well, most things have to do with carrots and sticks. So the devil. Okay.
Yeah.
So you got these four parts, and they all have to do with control. It's not about inspiring you. It's not about making sure you live a good life. It's not even necessarily about making sure that you're a good person. It's about, well, you have to do it because the omnipotent one said that you did. And I'm telling you that. Like, okay, well, I no longer listen to the omnipotent one. I don't really care. I'm a teenager or whatever. I'm a grown ass adult. Well, then it's your buddy who died for you. Like, you should be respectful of,
Right.
well, everybody dies. I don't care about that. Well, okay, then,
Yeah.
it's that spirit inside you. So for you to be a good person, and like, well, I don't care. Well, then you're going to hell. And there's this tormentor, and he can actually, the weird thing about Satan, I don't know if you looked into Satanism at all, which I feel weird even saying it. Have you heard of the
Not
concept or
not
have it?
not not much.
The
No.
weird thing
I mean,
is, the people, from what I understand, and I am not one, just to be really clear,
well, are you sure? I don't know.
I have actually been accused of that. And I'm like, actually, with my
Yeah.
belief system, I don't believe in any deities. So, like, you're totally getting this
Right.
wrong. Um, but sometime look up, and now that we have AI, you can easily do it. How many people did God kill, including the flood, et cetera, versus how many people did Satan kill? um, who is it that says that
Right.
they love you and they do all of this gaslighting and all of this control, and who is it who actually sort of undersells what it is that they're trying to do, and most for the most part is more factual. Now, I'm not I think, for me at least, my psyche, to do anything that would in any way endorse something that I have always seen as evil would be wrong, even if I don't believe that it exists. But there are
Sure.
people who, they're in a position that they're sort of tongue in cheek, and they're like, I am sort of against, I am not just an atheist, I'm an anti-theist. And the way that I'm going to express that, to just really drive the knife in, is to say that I'm, a satanic believer. And then people are like, oh, you're this horrible person. Like, no, you're totally missing the point. The point is, you've been
Right.
sold a bill of goods. And so anyways, I have not really interacted with satanic people at all, but I have done a little bit of reading to try and understand where they're coming from, because the way I was raised, and I'm guessing the way that you were raised, like, why would anyone do that? The only people who would do that would be completely corrupted, completely horrible people.
Right. Right.
And yet, the reason for that movement is a way of, identifying ways of thought, and to point out, hey, the monotheistic Holy Trinity and other belief systems, maybe they're actually all about power and control and getting hooks into people. Um,
Yeah. Absolutely. I think that yeah, it almost, from what I know of Satanism, it feels more like a way to parody religion than anything.
See,
Like,
I feel much more comfortable with pasta parodying religion. That's
yes.
my comfort zone.
Yep.
It comes from the same part of the world where a lot of these cults and religions and other things are.
Oh, that's right. I had forgotten that the flying spaghetti monster came from. Yeah.
Ramen. Remember, talk like a pirate day. Pirates are important, grog and all that.
Yep.
Um, so back to the two by twos briefly. You know, being gone, and I left way before Brewergate, and was on my own, pretty lonely, to be honest. Which loneliness, I think, is part of the human condition, and so
Hmm.
recognizing that in ourselves and in others can be actually an opportunity to reach out and realize. Um, I think it was Simon Sinek. I don't know if you know who he is. He's a pretty cool thinker, but he talks about friendship, and one of his statements, which I'll just paraphrase as best I can, is that we often think that when we're asking something of a friend, a real friend here, by the way, that we're some sort of an inconvenience to them. But the reality is, it's the person doing the asking, making themselves a little bit vulnerable, having that possibility of, hey, I'm too busy, be the response. They're the ones who are forging those bonds of friendship. And yet, for some
Hmm.
reason, we resist that. We're like, I don't want to seem needy. I don't want to be inconvenient or whatever. And yet, most people are lonely. It's possible to be in major relationships within a family or with a partner or whatever and be really lonely. I think part of
Yeah.
that is we just expect way too much of marriage partnerships in particular, which is why I think many of them, are under threat, is because there's
Right.
been this expectation that they do everything. Whereas a few generations ago, if you wanted to build a barn, you'd need the whole community. If you wanted to do such and such, you'd need help. We didn't have all the labor saving devices where you could try and live your life pretty much just as a family. And so we've lost some of that connection. So
Yeah,
have to
for
remember
sure.
to reach out, which is why groups like some of the ones that you have participated in and that you've volunteered as an admin on have become
Hmm.
so important. I mean, I remember the first weekend that I really spent much time on the Facebook group, and it just so happens that there was a ex member who was a female who was traveling down in my area, and I got permission to contact her. And I'm sure she thought I was a creep. And the reason is I was just so excited that someone who knew where I was coming from was in my area. And I had no expectation, no ulterior motives at all.
Right.
And I really don't know what the person thinks, but I was just so excited that there was actually someone in there. We never did actually do anything other than send a few messages. And the way that it just sort of faded away made me think, okay, I may have been a little bit too much, and I can understand that. And I'm really sorry. I don't know your background. I don't know if
Right.
you've had
Right.
creepers, but I probably sort of came across that way. Um,
But I'm glad that it's brought those kinds of connections, whether they work out or not, right? Because that was kind of that was kind of the reason that the group was established, and that many of the groups were established was to give people a connection that you just can't, you don't find, you're not gonna find another X2 by two just at the coffee shop. I mean, you might, but like the chances are really really slim, and you're not gonna know. So
well, and there
yeah,
are some areas where you may be the only one, and that's been
yeah,
largely my
totally,
experience. So yeah, and I've thought about what would it take to make this, because I have people in it that I love and care about. I want the best things for them. What would it take for this religion to become safe? And it would just take changing all the things that they hold dear. That's all it would take.
right, yeah, it's
because because the statement is, I have it written down somewhere, something along the lines of, if we went for a brief one, we follow the example Jesus set in the New Testament. Our ministers go out two by two without salary or possessions, preaching the gospel just as he instructed. It's a lifelong calling of devotion to God's word. We gather in homes because Jesus said the church isn't a building, but people coming together in his name. It goes on. But the thing is, workers who are supposedly celibate for the rest of their life being in homes, not a good idea. Like,
yeah,
workers in particular, their basic needs are set up to not be met. Like, you just look at
100%, yeah,
Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and they don't really have that much control over where they're going to be from year to year. They have to basically beg. And yet they also have this weird exalted position of authority. This is a perfect recipe for narcissism, especially as time goes on, for people
yeah,
to have a very weakened sense of self and autonomy and responsibility. all the while also having this elevated ego and this need to have the facade that everything's wonderful. And I don't know how to fix it. If I did, if I'm like, oh, we could just tweak this and then everyone would be fine. It's like, no,
Right.
like
No.
the
The solution makes it unrecognizable.
um so of course just about everything in that statement that I read is not true. The only thing that is pretty much true is the going forth two by two, which is why the name is very fitting. But do they really follow the example Jesus set in the New Testament? That sort of hints that it started there, and it's like, not really that
Yeah.
much more than
Not
any other
really.
group that is a
Right.
Christian, and they all argue. Um, Without salary or possessions, holy crap! I mean, I have people that I'm related to or that I know well who have millions in the bank in trust accounts. I mean, I know about estates. I have family members who have left because they were part of estates being handed over in the keeping of some of the friends, and some of the workers, overseer type workers, said, this isn't enough money for us. This estate has more. We need more in it.
Oh my goodness. Wow. Yeah. Well, that's a pretty heavy statement. That's big.
So the whole without salary or possessions, that leaves this idea. Now, religions, like most things biological, do evolve. And so I'm sure that you know this. I feel sort of like I'm being preachy towards you. You probably know more of this than I
No.
do with just your
You're
background.
good.
But like the first probably 3 to 5 years, William Irving, the only position really in the church was to give of all of your possessions and become a worker, the equivalent of what we call a worker
Right.
now. There weren't any
Yeah.
friends. And they're like, oh, this isn't really sustainable.
Right. And I know, I think they definitely came across that pretty quickly and were like, "Oh yeah, well, we're gonna need to get some homes going here so that we can keep this thing rolling."
Um, I had some communication with a family member, and I said essentially, hey, we're going to have family problems until those of you who are still in have at least some basic recognition of the problems going on in the church, and you think through it and deal with it appropriately. I don't know what that looks like, but I'll know it when I see it. And you haven't. And the response was, well, the Bible talks about this, and it says that there will be wolves in amongst the flock. And I did not respond. But my response now, if this person ever sees this and didn't follow my advice at the very beginning, you shouldn't be watching this, stay off the internet, is like, at what point do you have so many wolves that it's really just a wolf feeding program? It's not a
Right.
flock. It's not for the
Right.
protection. And by the way, the whole allegory of the flock is just a little bit too revealing, because who ends up killing the lambs? Who ends up fleecing them? So
Mhm.
there are just a lot of problems, and the sad thing is, some people, I mean, it's their life, and it was mine. It
Yeah.
actually was mine. There
Yeah.
was a point where I thought maybe I should go into work, actually.
Right. I
Which
think we
maybe
all
this
kind of
is
had
me
had a
coming out of
moment.
the closet and just saying that all of the bad things that have happened to me is because I didn't listen to God, and I should be in the work right now.
Ah, truth finally comes out.
See, I'm just a prodigal. Um,
Yes.
and an unrepentant one, apparently, with my laughter. But yeah, I'm a prodigal to nonsense.
Yeah.
And it's not my job to make anyone's life any harder. If one thought that I've had is, if I'm right about someone or something, then either it's like a one-time thing or it will be ongoing. And if it's ongoing, I don't need to do anything about it because they're sowing their own harvest there. And if I'm wrong, I probably should keep my mouth shut. And except there are some things like crimes, like where you like the only ethical thing to do is to step forward. And I find it
Right.
ironic that this group, who feels, a lot of the people in the group feel that they are just the only ones going to be saved. And you can only be saved through the word of the workers, by the way, which means they have complete control over the door to heaven. That actually it is the legal system that has the higher morals and ethics than they do. It's the legal
Absolutely.
system who says, hey, wait a sec, there are people who've been hurt and you can't just sweep this under the rug. And like, I don't know that much about what all's happened because I really am pretty removed. But this has been going on, as you I'm sure know, for a long, long time. When I was in practice, I think that I saw what I now recognize as some of the consequence of that. I saw we had some of the workers go through um, the clinic that I worked at, and most of them that I'm thinking of were sister workers, and they were resting. And I don't know for sure what happened, but That's where I found out about trust accounts, that there was money set aside for their care. They got all their care at the clinic I was at for free, but if they
Hmm.
needed care beyond the clinics that were, managed by the friends, then they had money for that, at least hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not a lot more than that.
Right.
And I'm like, these people are like sobbing. What's going on? And early in my years in practice, I actually did volunteer at a women's shelter, and I learned some of the things that happens with domestic abuse and sexual abuse. And now I recognize, I don't know for sure, and it was more than one individual that I'm referencing here. But yeah, so that was over
Yeah.
20 years ago.
Yeah. It's an epidemic, and it's never really been addressed. I mean, it's kind of being addressed now, but it's not really being addressed internally still.
And I can't spend too much. I'm not actually a member of any group of believers because I've been gone for so long. And I mean, I told you all what I did during meetings. Like, why would I put
Yeah.
myself in that environment? I mean, I just like really, this is really, and sometimes even on some of the shared spaces that we have, people present things as if everyone is a believer. And sometimes I've tried to be gentle and say, hey, and you guys as admins do an amazing job. But on the other hand, it's not your job to respond to everyone or to overly control the type of dialogue. Everyone does have the right to have their own
Right.
perspective, but um,
Yeah. It's a tough line to try to walk.
not going to get into this a lot. I think that a lot of I mentioned prior to our discussion here that's recorded that I think that um, intimacy, things that a lot of young people should be taught, is largely missing from the group. Even though I have had some very positive relationships, long-term relationships, there was a point as one relationship was just sort of naturally ending. I'm like, I got married young. I spent all of my adult life married and basically having someone who either is within the group that was my partner or someone who had never been in the group as my partner. I've never
Hmm.
actually spent hardly any time just as myself processing this stuff. And it
Hmm.
was right around, it was shortly after I made that decision that Brewergate and the Facebook group and everything else um, happened. And it's been good. I mean, it's something that I have really needed. It's also allowed me to focus on my children in their last years as they've gone into adulthood. Um, but ultimately, intimacy, which, all of the elements of that, is a really important part of human life. And this group in particular, not in particular, there are some others as well, but maybe more so than some, just doesn't talk about it other than it being bad. And I think some of it is,
Right.
this purity culture, which I think sometimes they may even have the right impression. Well, if there isn't anything that appears sexy, then maybe these sexually repressed people, workers, overseers, members, etc., maybe it won't get in. And that's actually not the way that sexuality works. Um,
Yeah. Totally.
and I am going to make a distinction that I think is important. This is me sort of coming in from a clinical perspective. I'm not a counselor. I could actually be phrasing this not quite right. There are some people who commit crimes of a sexual nature with young people just because of the opportunity. There are other people who are attracted to young people, and we often group them
Yeah.
together. I'm not saying that the harm is necessarily one is better or worse than the other, but I've just noticed that a lot of times those two groups of people who have different motivations, different physiologic responses involving lust and power and all of that, they do come at it from different angles. And I'm telling you, the way that the work has been set up, most people are going to have problems with repressed sexuality and with the figuring out a way to get their just basic intimacy needs met, which is a
Yeah.
very basic human condition. And I'm getting the impression, both a little bit that I've heard from you, but also from prior, that this does not seem to be recognized, that there are some really basic needs that they've said, oh, well, God will meet those needs. Well, of course, yeah, he's going to meet needs as well as he controls the weather for us when we pray.
Yeah.
That's my perspective. But even if I'm willing to give them that, it's like, well, this is a God of the gap sort of thing, how much, how harsh should the situation be before we're like, no, we shouldn't. We should actually make accommodations. We should change the structure. And so this whole, the way is perfect, but the people aren't. Let's say that we were to use that in athletics. My running coaching is perfect, but the people aren't. I don't have the best athletes, but I've got a great. What sort of runners would I have? They
Right.
wouldn't get hurt hardly at all because my training is perfect. That's the definition. They may not have the absolute most talent, but they wouldn't get hurt. They wouldn't make, mistakes very often, and they would get to their full potential. And so, um, if the way is really perfect, I just expect a lot more of it. And in reality, there's no way that it is. But I've heard that directly from people in the group, some of them of an older generation. And I finally got to the point where it's like, okay, at this point, I either have to totally tear this person down to make my point, or I have to just stop the discussion. And I'm like, this person is a family friend. It's not my point to tell them what a piece of shit they are right now. And so, they're going to get old and die, and they don't have to hear my thoughts right now. And it really came down to that. But
Right.
they were so brainwashed that they couldn't even, actually, their identity was so tied with the group and the group being the same that they couldn't lose that argument, even though they were wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. You can lead them. You can lead people right up to the water, but unless they're ready to drink, it's not going to do. Not going to. It's
And they
not going to
keep hurting
happen.
people. So
Yeah.
those of us who have connections with, and it's not just people in the group, but like learning appropriate boundaries, learning not
Hmm.
just with intimacy, but with communication, with expectations, with showing up at someone's house. Um, so many of us were taught that if someone important shows up, that we should be willing to give them our room to spend the night. That's weird.
Yeah.
Like, it was actually a
Totally.
partner of mine who pointed out, wow, you're like really pretty relaxed about this. This is actually a huge deal. Like, you don't just
Hmm.
let anyone eat. You're careful about who you let in your house, but then who actually spends the night? That's sort of like a thing.
Yeah.
And I'm not even talking about sex and intimacy here. I'm just talking about someone spending the night at a home. And yet,
Right.
most of us, especially if we were children, we observed this and we're like, oh yeah, we trust them.
Yeah. Not even a second thought about it, and it's really interesting to know that when we grew up with all those expectations, it just normalized the complete absurdity of it all.
Oh, I
Yeah.
did have one more thought. It's something I've chatted about with some other people, and it comes back to the workers a little bit. Um, as I think most of us know, or I'm guessing we have a shared experience, that there's sort of an expectation of, you're either, as a young person, you're either going to go into work or you're going to not go into work, and you're likely to have a home, which usually means getting married, having babies. That's sort of the expectation. So, what about someone who they aren't attracted to the other sex? What about someone who um, they may not be neurotypical? They don't, it's really hard for them to interact with other people as a whole. There's really not much of a place for
Yeah.
them. And so what happens sometimes is, and I'm talking about really good people. I'm thinking of a couple right now. They're like, well, the work must be for me because I'm not finding a partner. I'm getting older. This must be God calling, because there's a lot of talk about God calling. And sometimes they're in their, 20s. And often I think workers, the overseers, sometimes have said, hey, you're too young, but not always. These people don't even know who they are yet, and they're
Hmm.
in the work, they're schedule, they're being bounced around, they're not really supposed to have anything. They start to observe the way things are supposed to be is one thing, and the way things really are is something different. There's this expectation that they have wisdom on everything because, the living word, or the living witness type thing, where, are you familiar with that? I'm guessing there was actually a
Oh
song
yeah.
about, yeah, that philosophy. And therefore workers and what they say is the thing that can determine whether or not you are able to have salvation. There's all this pressure on them, and they don't even freaking know who they are a lot of times.
Yeah.
And so, as I think both you and I are aware, some of them realize, hey, wait a sec, I may not be heterosexual, but it's not safe for me to even think about that. I
Yeah.
may not be binary as far as my sexuality. By the way, I lectured this last week on the way that the reproductive system differentiates, and about 2% of the time, it's not going to be the typical male or female pattern. So intersex is a thing. There can be a variety of things that impact, gender identity. There are environmental and hormonal components that aren't just someone's choice. Um, and so probably a little bit higher percentage than the typical 2 by 2 population are workers with these various things that they may not even know when they go into the work.
Yeah.
I can think of one or two that are were some of my favorite workers, and if I were to hear that they did anything horrible to someone, I'd be heartbroken because they meant so much to me. And I don't know if I'm like, I'm not sure that gaydar is a thing. It's probably even rude for me to say it. I have friends who are, partnered with same sex, and we joke about stuff like that. But I'm like, I'm pretty sure that this person, their orientation, is not hetero. I don't know what that is. I don't know if
Yeah.
they're asexual. I don't know if they're homosexual. I don't know. I don't know. But um, great people, and had to have been really hard. I'm thinking one no
Really hard.
longer no
Yeah.
longer in the work, but I think still within the group, and
Right.
just a very peripheral role, because again, there, at least when I was still in, there wasn't much of a role or much respect or anything for people who weren't either able to stay in the work for as long as possible, or get married and have a home.
Yeah.
um, so I worry about those people. I care about those people.
I'm going to just ask one last question, and that is, uh, what would be your advice for anyone who is, perhaps exiting the two by twos and they have these doubts about not just the two by two system, but about faith in general? How would you recommend that they move forward?
Well, the first thing is, a lot we have been programmed to have a lot of fear for leaving, and
Hmm.
some of that is unique to the 2 by 2s. A lot of it is just religion in general, and Christianity. Protestant Christianity programs people to be fearful. Um, I was just sure that if I left, that the next week I'd be on crack cocaine and doing whatever, based on what I had heard. And there, I've observed that there are really really good people of all walks of life, and so whatever those fears are about what you might become, or what sort of inclinations you may have, most of them are just nonsense.
Yeah.
There is some, I lost a lot of connections with people that I thought were friends, and some of them boomeranged back. It took 15 years or more. It took Brewergate.
Hmm.
See, God does work in mysterious ways. I shouldn't joke about that, because I know that there are people who really were hurt and abused. Um, but most of the stuff that you have fears about are things that you've actually been programmed to have fears about. And you're going to find freedom in stuff that you're like, oh my goodness, how could I have missed this my whole life? And I don't know what that will be for you. For me, that may be something goofy, like on a Sunday morning, instead of going to meeting and wondering what I'm going to say, I'm like, you know what? I wonder what's going on in science research. That's going to be my meditation for the day. Or maybe I'm backpacking, and I wake up and there's a beautiful mountain or something like that. I
Yeah.
don't know what that will be for each person, but there's a wonderful universe out there. And I think at the very beginning, I talked a little bit about how life is a paradox. And it's true that we're going to live and die and we're basically just sort of dirt. But it's also true that we are made of stardust based on what science tells us, which is pretty cool. And that we are
Hmm.
connected to all of the living things around us, and through the living things, connected to the inanimate things as well. We have a connection with this earth. We have a connection with the cosmos. And for me, I find peace in that. For other people, it may be music, it may be dance, it may be fashion. Fashion is obviously lost on me, but that you will find that there were constraints that you may not have even realized were there, and then you'll realize, oh, those were put there on purpose. And I just realized that there's this glass wall, I don't, or ceiling or floor or whatever, and it's not there anymore. By taking that step of, what, I'm going to have a self-directed life, and I'm going to find out what I really believe is true, rather than what I've been told is true. um, you're not going to live any longer necessarily. You're going to still die.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. But there's still a lot of beauty in the fact
Yeah.
that we don't really understand what this is. And you don't even have to pretend that you understand. You don't even have to pretend that
Yep.
you understand the meaning in this. You can make the meaning, what it is. Actually, as I was leaving, or no, while I was, after I stopped taking part, but I continued going to meeting, someone asked me, "Why do you keep going?" And I said, "Because I find meaning in it." And they said, "Well, why do you find meaning in it?" And it's because I said, "Because I choose to. I choose to find meaning. I choose to find meaning in continuing going to meeting, in singing the hymns, in being there with my family, and that's why it's special to me." And the thing is, you can do that with anything.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you for that, and thanks for sharing your whole story, Dan. Really appreciate it.
There are a lot of people who care. So also, if you're having concerns or anxiety or worries about things, reach out. Human connectedness, part of it as well.